Don't let rampant politics and clusterfuckery ruin all your projects and your sanity. Smooth ugly penny lines and make it all make sense. Get experience by osmosis here on Corporate Underpants.
Welcome back to Corporate Underpants. You're in for a treat with part 2 of my episode with Dana Chisnell. When we left off, Dana had gone from doing usability testing for tech companies in San Francisco to becoming one of the leading voices in civic design after the chaos of the year 2000 election for president and the butterfly ballot disaster, which some of you remember and some of you do not and should look it up. That path eventually led her straight to Washington, D.C., where she found herself sitting around a table with a bunch of other digital experts in the West Wing, talking about how badly government had failed everybody with technology with the botched launch of healthcare.gov, which was supposed to help every single person in the United States sign up for healthcare. Then in walked President Obama, and I would have just died right there and have had nothing to say, but Dana managed to live through it as he told the room that fixing digital services for the American public was going to be part of his legacy, and he wanted their help in doing it. Goosebump City. So in part 2, we pick up right there. We're actually going inside the U.S. Digital Service, healthcare.gov, immigration systems built on paper, and what it actually takes to bring user-centered design into the giantest organizations that were never built for it. Let's get into it.
And he walked into the room while you guys were all sitting around a table.
Yeah.
And you didn't know he was coming.
No.
And
He
what
was
did
busy.
he say?
He was busy. He'd just come from, he was either coming from or going to a press conference and had to make a statement about what was happening in the Middle East. Some things never changed. What he said was that delivering services over the public internet was going to be part of his legacy, that technology was going to be important to ensuring that Americans could get the benefits that they deserve, that the failure of the launch of healthcare.gov, this was the biggest, by the way, service delivery that had happened in the government to date of implementing the Affordable Care Act, now sometimes called Obamacare, to launch that in October of 2013. Apparently nobody knew how to launch a website at scale at the time, and it fell over. The servers fell over. And when they were up, the response time was terrible. It was awful latency.
But for the whippersnappers, again, these are slightly less whippersnappery, but healthcare.gov was after this enormous, is part of this enormous effort to get all Americans covered by health insurance, right?
Yeah.
And that healthcare.gov was the marketplace in which every single option would be available to every single American, and that everybody could log on and get healthcare of some kind or another and get everyone covered. And so there's this huge buildup to a website launching that then absolutely collapsed in on itself, which is not that surprising, honestly, because at that time, the technologies weren't as robust. I mean, we weren't using dial-up modems or anything, but having everybody or some giant or even some tiny percentage of Americans logging on trying to get healthcare at the same time, and it was a huge embarrassment.
Yeah. It hadn't occurred to anybody who was involved in actually creating and delivering that program that millions of people would come to the website at the same time.
Yeah.
But it turns out they did, because there was a lot of need and a lot of interest, and the technology did not support that. So the federal chief technology officer, Todd Park, who came from Silicon Valley, had done some startup stuff himself, including a major medical health insurance company, called on a few of his tech nerd friends to come have a look at the system, see what was going on, and see if they could help fix it. Over about 3 or 4 months, they indeed did do that, implementing a bunch of a bunch of changes that you can read about in other places. And ultimately, 8 million people signed up for healthcare. They took a lot of work to do that. And today, tens of millions of people get their health insurance through healthcare.gov, through the exchanges that are related to that. But at the time, it was a really big deal. Anyway, so President Obama, goes on in this talk saying that fiasco was not only embarrassing, it hurt a lot of people because they needed a health insurance, and the promise that we made of making it available to them was broken. And it turns out that there are something like 30 other projects at the time that kind of look like that in the federal government, where there are these big systems that are part of policy implementation. And he never wanted to see anything break like that ever again. So he was forming this team. And in case we hadn't figured it out, he was there because he wanted us to come work for him.
And oh my God. I mean, I can't even imagine what your guts felt like at that moment. Like I would have just fallen out of my chair. And this was the birth of the US Digital Service, or had it existed before?
No, this was the birth of the digital service. It was announced about 10 days later.
Oh my God. Okay, so there's a bunch of people sitting around this table. There's what, 20 people, 15, 20 people.
Mhm.
I am assuming most of you said yes. And then you found yourself now an employee of the federal government.
Yeah.
And what was your job?
Our titles all were the same. They were digital services expert. But the thing that my business card said was generalist problem solver.
Generalist problem solver.
Yeah.
For America. Okay, more power to you. I hope you kept that card because that's really freaking cool.
I do have a couple of them around, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so and then what did you find yourself doing?
The day I walked in, there were 3 projects going on. One was healthcare.gov. It was the second year of open enrollment, and the system still was not as robust as it needed to be. So there were a bunch of people who showed up to bolster it and make sure that it worked. It did. So that was one. Another one was in July or August of 2014, Congress had passed a law allowing veterans to use their benefits outside the VA network. But here it is, the day I showed up was the middle of October, and this law was supposed to go into effect on Veterans Day, which is November 11th, and nobody had done anything yet to implement it, to let veterans know that they could do this, and there wasn't any support on the VA side to do that. So there were a bunch of people, presidential innovation fellows and folks from an internal digital services agency called 18F showed up to kind of work on that. And then there was this other third project for US Citizenship and Immigration Services, where I knew a couple of people who had self-identified and self-assigned themselves to that project. USCIS was in the throes of a digital transformation. Up until 2012, 100% of all immigration processes were done on paper. And yeah, so think about regular order kind of immigration stuff like green cards for lawful permanent residents and naturalization for people who want to become American citizens. Millions of those people apply every year, but there are hundreds of other benefits and statuses that people can apply for. And all of that happened on paper. In fact, there are salt mines and caves across the country that still hold those paper documents from the earliest days of immigration.
Wait a minute. Literally caves full of documents?
Yeah.
Oh my God, you are kidding. Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's keep going. Yeah. Corporate underpants, the Flintstones style.
Well, it turns out that salt mines are a really good place for storing things. Anyway, everything was on paper. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services was trying to digitally transform to moving everything online. And while they had been at this for a few years already, they still had not pressed the button and released anything to the public. And so it was this team's job to get them to the point where they did that, because while they were doing digital transformation, they were also trying to move from a software development practice of waterfall kind of development where, one it's all serial and it takes a long time, to an agile approach where you have continuous development and continuous improvement. That's uh, we could have that conversation some other time,
some
but
other time. But that was like such a huge
it was a big deal.
moment in our field too, where
Yeah,
the giant push for changing how we thought about gathering requirements or creating plans or organizing technical work was changing at the same time. And there were also these, I'm assuming you walked into these, what you're describing is these giant ongoing projects that had been going and going and going for years
yeah,
that weren't done yet. And so that's an interesting collision, right? Of people saying, let's plan it first and then build it doesn't work. And by the way, here's a great example. But you still want to get stuff done. You want to get it out. You want to finish it.
exactly. And the other, so for USCIS, this is a good example. They had spent 2 or 3 years gathering requirements, another couple of years putting out requests for information, requests for proposals, receiving proposals back, evaluating them. Then, and by the way, all the requirements are business operations, right? What are the legal things that we have to do
Right.
to deliver these services or statuses? Nothing about user requirements at all. So no attention on what it would take for immigration officers who use these systems to do their work. And so that whole process up to the point where you make an award to a company like IBM, it was IBM in this case originally, it takes 5 to 7 years. So the technology has changed, the business operations have also changed because laws change, policies change, et cetera. Users change. And so IBM got a contract. They made a very suboptimal thing. They were fired. And USCIS had a new CIO at that point, and he decided that he was going to bring it all in-house. So while they had contracted developers and technical leads, business analysts from different companies, nobody was making a giant piece of software. It was much more agile in the development practices, and everybody was there on site, which is another thing, right? Like usually you let a contract, you hand it off, you wait, and IBM or whoever comes back in 3 to 5 years.
I mean,
And
anybody out there who's thinking about how in their jobs they're trying to wrangle a lot of stakeholders or do a big piece of software or something, the perspective here is just so interesting. You can't not try. This is not something where it's a startup that's going to lose money for its investors if you don't launch. This is the entire US government. This is all the people. These are promises made on a political scale. And at the time, also, immigration was seen as something that was related to the Statue of Liberty. Give us, you're tired, you're hungry, you're poor, not let's throw them in the equivalent of concentration camps. Not that I have an opinion about that. So it really was the zeitgeist was different politically. It was also different technically. And there were these huge, ginormous contracts that get awarded through a ginormous process. I got to see I accidentally worked for the DOD when I first graduated because I was canvassing for an environmental group and got offered a job, which is just bananas. But seeing how these small business innovative research contracts went through and that they would send me to get an update from Georgia Tech, it's just this incredibly red tape, underpantsy process. You were doing it as large as humanly possible. And real people were being impacted or not getting helped.
Yeah.
And how do you come into something like that is so embedded? By that point, this idea of how you would create a contract, how you would win a contract on a technical basis, that was really set and embedded. So how
it
do you-
was, but the people who I worked with at USCIS were all people who could see that system was not working. That old system of the way of doing things was not giving them the results that they wanted. So they were ready to do something else. And they had pretty good leadership. And then the digital service team that I was on showed up there to enable, support, coach, teach even more and better practices.
So what did your job end up being next? You were in US Digital Service, you were working on immigration stuff in the salt mines, so to speak. And what was your title by this point?
I was still a digital services expert, but the work that I was doing was largely started out as user research, right? I went out to the service centers where deferred action for title arrivals gets adjudicated, and I sat next to immigration officers who were reviewing and making those decisions to learn how they did it and see the crappy tools that they had for doing that work, and came back and reported on that to DC. But I was the only designer researcher there out of about 120 or 150 people. I could not do all the design there was to do. There were 11 or 12 front end developers altogether. And really, I ended up corralling them on doing better user interface and interaction design. Ultimately, I ran a bunch of experiments and to try to get better practices going generally. We ran regular usability testing. This is also, remember, working remotely was not a thing. And to do usability, I didn't have a lab. I didn't have any support. I was trying to get enough ahead to whatever the next sprints were to do prototypes and test those out with subject matter experts, with immigration officers across the country. And using Skype for Business on computers that are not set up for it, and running these sessions where I made the front end developers sit and listen and watch. Like I would literally go to their scrum rooms and grab them and say, okay, we're going to do this now and you're going to watch and listen. And I did that a few times. And then one day I came in, I'm like, we're going to do some more testing on this prototype. And everybody was missing. Like I couldn't find any of the front end developers to harass them. And so I started going around to their scrum rooms, and what had happened was they had all tuned into the testing from their scrum rooms, and they were making their teams listen and watch too. I was like,
and I want
it's
to pause
working.
here. I want to pause here because I know where this is going, because I know what you ended up doing on a bigger scale, but also, there's so much talk right now about how do we get influence? How do we use AI in our work? How can we be a team of whatever?
It's just bullying.
What?
It's just bullying.
Bullying? Okay. I want to hear more about that in a second. But
no, it's about building relationships.
It's about building relationships. It's about, or even most simply put, drag someone else's ass into watch. You ask some basic questions to users. Basic questions like, what would you click next? This ancient, in terms of user experience and usability, idea of make someone above you watch someone else, your intended user, use some version of what it is you plan to build. Yeah. And in a way, that simple thing, which is not as simple in in practice, you have to go around and drag some developers in or whatever. But that's really powerful, because what just happened was you were dragging them into watching users stumble over shit. Then one day you went to find them and discovered they were making their teams watch users stumble over shit.
Yeah, because they learned things from doing this about how the work got done. They had no information. None of them was an expert on immigration. And they get a user story. They don't know how to implement it because they're imagining how users do their stuff. And so they were getting value out of those sessions, and it was helping them make better decisions. It wasn't really enough because even though I was going out to field offices to do research and I would come back with information like in a naturalization interview, and for anybody watching this, you can back me up on this. In a naturalization interview, the immigration officer can do any of the things that they need to do in any order. And so some of the required things are an English test, a written English test, a spoken English test, a civics test, which I'm pretty sure that most native born Americans could not pass. And you have to answer, they've changed the passing criteria, but at the time you had to answer 6 out of 10 correctly. I think it's more than that now. And then there are a few other things. You go through the application form, which at the time was about 25 pages long, and verify the answers to the questions on the application form. But you can do this in any order. So the immigration officer head of the interview would look at the file, which in some cases was gigantic, like 1,000 pages, because people come here as student on student visa, and then they get an H-1B and they go to work for an American company. They get married to somebody. They end up with a green card through a family-based adjustment of status. This is what that's called. And then they apply for citizenship, and all of that stuff stacks up over time. But immigration officers go through that and they can see a history. And so you might have been in the country for 15 years, but your English still might not be great. So the immigration officer might decide that they're going to do your English tests first. Or they know that people are really freaked out about the civics test, and they'll try to get that out of the way right away because people study really hard for that. And that lowers the stress and they can go on with the rest. Now,
It's hard
developers
to imagine them coming at this with kindness, but it sounds like you're saying that's what they actually did.
There was a time when they did.
Yeah.
Developers did not believe me when I told them that you could do this in any order because they're trying to develop a user interface that has some logic to it. And I made a bet with the product owner at one point and asked her to send out 3 developers and a technical lead to a field office so they could watch interviews. And her position was that design was a technical problem and that coders should be coding 100% of the time. Also, the contracts did not have money in them or conditions in them that actually allowed anybody to go into the field to do observations like
So wait,
this.
so how did you okay, so hold on one second.
So
okay.
the bet was that if this pod of developers went out into the field for one day,
Yep.
they went to the Philadelphia field office, which was very happy to receive them, to observe 4 or 5 or 6 interviews. If when they came back, the quality of their work wasn't better and their velocity wasn't faster, I would shut up and this never happened.
Okay, I love this. And I'm like, what I tell people about, I have all this stuff on personas. I used to do data-driven personas. Now I do alignment personas with assumptions. The reason I'm telling you this is because recently we've been telling the story of at Amazon. We tried doing data-driven personas. It didn't work. And instead we did this sort of alignment work, but we didn't tell anybody. And so just spending a couple of hours making sure everybody defined terms the same way and putting names on our assumptions about who the users are and what they wanted and needed to do. We didn't get permission. We did it small enough so that nobody noticed. It didn't cost anything, right? And then we're able to point later to the result and say that this launch of this thing sucked less than everybody expected.
Right, exactly.
Right. And so the expectation isn't enormous. And actually, the action isn't enormous. The action is really small. It's let's have one conversation we're not used to having. And
Right.
then let's see what happens. Because creating a pull by launching something that sucks less than everybody expected it to is often easier than creating. And so you did exactly the same thing. You said, let me just have a couple people for a couple hours.
Yeah.
And let's see what
So-
they do.
Yeah. So they took the 6 o'clock train from DC to Philly, headed to the field office there, were met by the office director, and then they sat in the corner of immigration officers' offices, listened, offered nothing, took notes where they had a chance between interviews. They asked follow-up questions, and then got on a train and came back home.
I bet they were
Okay.
so re-energized when they came home too. I bet they were buzzing.
They were uncontainable. So we had pizza lunch the next day. I bought them pizza, and they were like, "Oh my God, I can't wait to do this again. I have so much more clarity about what we're trying to do, how the work gets done, what immigration officers need. Uh, I still have questions, but now I think I know how to look for the answers for those. When can we do this again?"
Because developers want to develop stuff that people actually use.
Yeah, they do.
They don't wanna develop stuff that people hate, and it's all I think it's still seen as conflict. And it also can't help but remind me of the debate that's going on right now about quote unquote synthetic users in AI, and how it can save so much time and you get such better information, but it's still true that if you send one developer out to listen during the course of one other human trying to get something done, they're gonna come back buzzing.
Yep.
Because they are also puzzle fanatics, just like UX people.
Yes. Yes.
And if you give them the juicy goodness of a real puzzle, then they can get about to solving it.
Yeah, exactly. So we did this and proved it out over the next 2 sprints. Their sprints were 2 weeks long,
Okay.
and they had this ritual where they did end of sprint demos for the subject matter experts who acted as the users and ultimately gave the thumbs up or the thumbs down to whether the thing met the user acceptance criteria. And up until this point, this team sent about 30% of their stories back to the backlog every sprint because the user is like, no. And for the next 2 sprints, all of the stories were accepted.
Oh my God.
And I got email from the subject matter expert's boss saying, "What did you do to these guys? Because the stuff is really good." So besides the field visits, we'd also changed sort of the rhythm of what happened in the sprints because they were not showing anything until the very end. I was like, what if you just did a really crappy kind of mock-up at the beginning based on the stories that you have of the sprint, and you showed that, trying to trick them into doing prototypes, and you showed that to users, to your SMEs, and got feedback right away before you commit any code. And they're like, "Yeah, I could do that."
You just don't call it a prototype. You're like, what if we
Yeah.
do this little thing? I love how you have become that also what you're talking about is this bigger picture thing that we should all remember too, that when faced with a giant problem or a giant challenge, often the best place to look is the tiniest, smallest place that you can influence at the moment. You were in this position in the US Digital Service of being like this digital expert, and now you're just asking one person to do one thing in a slightly different way.
Yeah, basically, yeah. Yeah, that period is where I went from being practitioner, doer, maker to enabler, teacher, coach, cheerleader, nagger. And every day I was wondering, what am I supposed to be doing today? How am I going to move this forward? And I made up a lot of stuff as I went along, and some of it worked. The design sprint did not work, but we
So
fixed that.
okay, the design sprint did not work. That's interesting. Why?
Doing a Google X style startup design sprint happens in 5 days, and at least at the time, my government partners could not move that fast.
Mhm.
I couldn't get the people in the room that I needed to have in the room, and I did the same thing. I just stretched it out over 8 weeks.
Yeah, and so so what year are we up to? What title? Because we're gonna keep going.
So I left the digital service in 2016,
Okay,
October of
so but
2016.
before that, you ended up with a bigger title, right? Were you still the government at that point when you left the digital
Yeah.
service? Oh,
Yeah.
okay, keep going.
Yes. So instead of staying for the 3 months that I thought that I was gonna be there for, I stayed for an entire 2-year tour. I left in October of 2016, went off and worked in a civic incubator with some friends on a thing that we called Project Redesign. After, actually, I should say, I went back to the Center for Civic Design for a few years, worked with the Virginia Department of Elections pretty intensely for a couple of years, and did a bunch of other stuff in the election space. Then left there in 2020, started what we called Project Redesign at the National Conference on Citizenship, where we tried to apply human-centered design to policy design, policy making. Some very worthwhile experiments, including seeding how the Biden administration approached refugee admissions in a much speedier way. So yeah, did that for a few years. And then President Biden was elected. A bunch of my friends were going back into government. And so I boomeranged back to the digital service in February of 2021. And immediately, not quite immediately, worked on some COVID response things because it was still COVID then, and like emergency rental assistance. And then got myself assigned to the Department of Homeland Security because I wanted to go back to work on immigration related stuff.
Now, you're not there anymore. I'll go ahead and say that right now, and haven't been for a while. When you were working at such a big department that is so spread out, and you had discovered that involving other people, mentoring them to do some of this good work on their own, what I'm getting at is that you, I think at this point, we're working on this whole model of how do you empower people with the tools of UX, of usability, of design, of communication, of information architecture. And this is really interesting because at the in the zeitgeist of UX, this was still a big time of, no, we who are trained have to be doing this work. And if other people are doing this work, they're doing it wrong and they're diluting our industry. Information architects have to be trained to do information architecture. Don't just have, and it's developer, somebody who codes can also not also be a user interface designer, which is all both true and useless to somebody in your position who is trying to impact the outcome, the output of the ginormous set of organizations. And I know because I've seen your presentations on this, and Jared Spool talks about some of the stuff that you've done in this too. But at the time, how did you approach that? How did you tell everybody else how you did this?
I did very little telling. But sorry, you were going to ask a follow-up question.
No, I just thought I left you in a weird spot.
Yes.
I know. So what I'm getting at is what I've heard about your efforts to not limit the number of people who know how to do some of these things to the people who have tons. You democratized some of our field.
I really hate that term, but
okay, please tell it. Then just there, you go now.
So the challenge that I have with talking about it as democratizing is that suggests an institutional construct that doesn't exist. We don't have certifications. We don't have licenses. So it's not like we're giving it away. And there's way more work to do than can be done by the number of professionals that are available. When I walked in the door at USCIS in 2014, there were 0 designers of any kind. Nobody knew the words user-centered design. And they looked at me weird when I said that. Fast forward to 2021, and there are product teams, there are product managers, there are UX people, there are interaction designers. There are not nearly enough of them, but they exist. By the time I left in the spring of 2025, which seems like forever ago now, so much has happened, there were 90 designers just at USCIS. There were at least 200 design-ish persons across the department who I knew about, and probably lots of other ones. But the cool thing is, when I came back in 2021 and started to look at the landscape across this giant department, 260,000 employees, that doesn't account contractors, people had figured out that you needed to listen to your users and know them and understand what their needs were. And people were making up listening sessions or public engagement events where they were doing things that you would recognize as human-centered design practices They didn't know that was a thing. And like when I moved from being in the digital service to then becoming the executive director for customer experience at the department, we did everything we could possibly do in that team to enable those people to do more of that and to do it better and to make it parts of their jobs so they were rewarded for doing it.
Enable them to do more of it and to do better and get rewarded for it.
Yeah,
I
that's a
love that
key thing.
because all of us can take that on, is enable more people to do better work, see the results, and get rewarded for it as well.
Yeah.
And part of that reward could be as simple as, hey, look, we've got fewer questions coming in through support. Anything to reward, doesn't have to be money, but to have
No,
that perspective.
but there's also a mindset in civil service that if it's not in my job description, it comes under this clause of and any other duties as assigned.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And those kinds of activities often came under any other duties as assigned. So instead, we tried to create infrastructure and practices at the department where it was actually part of people's performance
So your
plan.
users really became the people that worked in the organization,
Mhm.
and your product and project became whatever materials or information or whatever you could give them to do this kind of work better.
Yeah,
And I
exactly.
think that's a really great example of, as people become more and more senior in our field, in user experience, usability, information architecture, whatever, I think where some of the power comes from is seeing our colleagues as our users or our bosses as our users, as opposed to saying, well, all this internal stuff, all this political stuff is something I'm going to avoid. I'm going to avoid politics,
Oh,
which has quite a twist to it these days. You can't avoid politics in your life, and you really shouldn't be ignoring politics in your work, because if you can master this, how do decisions get made? How does work get done? What materials can I create that make my colleagues better at doing better work?
yeah.
That's where real seniority and influence comes from. It's a service to the people you work with and for.
Yeah,
And I think
exactly.
your career is a huge example of that.
And I got lucky in terms of timing ending up at DHS when I did, because there was alignment from the bottom to the top, all the way up to the secretary and beyond to the president, who signed an executive order in December of 21, specifically calling for departments to create customer experience functions and outlined what that looks like. And that was basically how I ended up. There was a position that was created to support that at the department. So there was alignment to do this work, and then I could focus on operationalizing that through a
Which
bunch of mechanisms, from performance management to procurement and how that worked. The thing that I failed at was making any inroads in human resources, because that is a very hard nut to crack in the
What do you
federal
mean
government.
by inroads in human resources? I just
Well, so there are not job classifications for designers and product managers
oh,
in the federal government. It takes years to get those things written, designed,
yeah.
cleared, signed off, into place. And there's a lot of workarounds around hiring people into those positions, into doing that work. And so, like, when we're recruiting people to do that work, we have to explain you're not going to see user experience designer or user experience researcher in the title of the job posting. But if you read the posting, even though it says IT specialist, you will see that the duties and the tasks are related to what you're going to end up doing.
Okay, so now I want to catch us up to where we are now, because I really want to hear about what you're doing. So you left Department of Homeland Security in spring of 2025, which probably is not going to come as a huge surprise to anybody, although your personal reasons for that, or you can talk about or not, which must have been interesting and hard because you had put so much effort into making changes there and doing something at that scale. Is there anything you want to say about that time, or?
Yeah, no, it was incredibly rewarding to do the work. I led this customer experience team, which was largely a human-centered design team, for almost 3.5 years. We made huge strides. The momentum that we had by the end of 2025, by the end of 2024, really, was pretty impressive. Not gonna lie about that. And, by that time, we had also established CX functions in TSA, Customs and Border Protection, USCIS, FEMA, the Cybersecurity and Information Security Agency. There's another one that I'm forgetting. And so 6 out of the 8, which is pretty good. And that meant that there was leadership sign-off, that there were people staffed to it, that there were humans in place who were running those efforts in those agencies, and they were having impact on services that were delivered throughout. The thing is, like, we were all ruthlessly, relentlessly focused on outcomes for the public, and everything moved from that. What do we want for the public? What's the experience that we want them to have? And how do we back into that in the best possible ways? And that changed a lot of the conversations. So we made a lot of progress in that time. I built this team from the ground up. When I left, there were 46 feds and about 25 contractors on the team, plus all of the folks who were in the component agencies. So it was pretty great. I don't want to count the progress simply by the number of humans that there were. It's hard for me to, like, impossible to talk about some of the things that we did. But if you just take USCIS as an example, where nothing was online in 2014 to 2024, where dozens, hundreds really, of services are online, and much of it is self-serve, including really basic things like changing your address or changing your appointment for your biometrics collection. Tracking, a thing that we couldn't do for many years, was tell you what the status of your case was and when you should expect to be able to hear about it. And we had enough data and we had enough talent by 2023 or 4 to implement a service where when you create an account with USCIS and you apply for a benefit, we can tell you in a range what to expect based on the characteristics of
I mean,
your
that's
case.
enormous. If people haven't ever worked for the government, the pace is so glacial. It is so that the idea of even just doing something basic, let's let them change their address online, which at any corporation would be like a sprint. Actually having that up and running and cleared and available and staffed and integrated is enormous. That happened within one person's lifetime, to say nothing of one person's.
There are so many factors that go into why that thing is the way it is. There are laws, for example, that require that you be mailed status updates or documents to a residential address, which in this day and age is expensive and ridiculous. And what happens then is you build a service where people can opt in to getting email notifications or text notifications, as well as getting these paper notifications. And then eventually somebody will say, "It's stupid. Let's pass a law that says we don't need to do that anymore." But it takes a long time for those kinds of things to happen. But those are some of the reasons that these things that seem like they're obvious bureaucracy hurdles, it could be because the law was written in 1990.
It is what it is. And I think that's another part of becoming more senior, is that some of the like glossy, let's do everything right, that we come right out of school with, you have to realize that there is this legacy. Always in every organization, there's a legacy of communication, there's a legacy of hierarchy, there's a legacy of influence, there's a legacy of, technology, habit, the first building they were, whatever it is, it's there. And getting grumpy about the fact that you can't get something done, it turns out to be less interesting than digging around and figuring out why. Oh, because they were stored in salt mines. And that's why people with
Yeah.
NaCl allergies aren't allowed to process immigration documents. Like, weird, if
Yeah.
you approach it as if there's legacy to find there, if that you need to become a spelunker of the cave of whatever you're operating in, things get interesting on a different front than
Yeah.
we thought they were going to get interesting at school.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. You can look at something on its face and say, this thing needs to be rewritten. It needs to be redesigned to make it really useful to people. In fact, we contemplated doing this on my team for a really important immigration document. And when we went to the attorneys who we brought in to our design team from the beginning, instead of the usual government thing, which is you make a thing and then you go to the attorneys and they review it and they go and you make changes until you're basically mediating. In this case, we're like, we need the lawyers on our side to understand what our intentions are from the beginning. And so we did. We brought them into a workshop and they freaked out about what we were trying to do. Like, where are you on this? Stop spending time and money on this. And we're like, why? And they said, because there are 5 or 6 different cases that came from the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court basically has designed this form. This is why it is the way it is. This form is not for the people we give it to. It is for law enforcement and lawyers. Leave it alone, go work on something else. The kind of bureaucracy hacks that you're talking about, for me, that's part of the fun of it, right? Like, why is this thing the way it is?
Yes, that is part of the fun of it.
And how can I work around that? Or can I remove those rocks?
Yeah.
Or can I smooth them off somehow?
Okay, so I have
So
3 more questions for you.
Okay.
Given that I've already been talking to you for so long, and I really appreciate it. One question for you is what and how did you decide what to do after you left the government? The second one is, do you have any additional thoughts or advice for people who are seeking to become as senior as you've become? And the third one is selfish, which is there are so many of us out of work right now, and there are so many of us struggling mentally and emotionally and professionally with what's going on. From where you sit, are there good places to put our energy to help stop things, to help the country right now?
Yeah. And so you may have to remind me of the questions as I
That's
answer.
fine. Yeah, sorry.
We're back up to the first one. How did I decide what I was going to do next after I left the government? I hadn't decided when I left. The reason that I left was because there were executive orders from the president that I morally could not implement, but it was my job to do that. So the only option I had was to resign. So I did. I did not know what was going to happen next, but Bloom found me and invited me to come do this work for a while. It was supposed to
Bloom
be
is
6
the company you work for now.
Bloomworks is the company I work for now. It is a
Bloomworks.
woman-owned company that does consulting to help state and local governments, largely, although some federal too, deliver better services. And so it's been my role as a kind of senior fellow to help on innovation and extending the impact of the work that they do, which is absolutely excellent. Yeah, if you get a chance, spend a couple of minutes going around the site because some of the case studies and the insights are really fantastic, especially a bunch of the work around child welfare, unemployment, and lots of other awesome, juicy things. A phenomenal company. I was lucky to land there. It's been a good place for me, but my term is coming up. So I'm figuring out what to do next from there. Your second question was
Advice for people who want to become senior.
yeah, live a long life.
Yeah, seriously, just get old. Like automatic.
Yeah, a couple of things come to mind. One is keep learning because methods change, technology changes. I wrote a book about usability testing that was published in 2008. If I wrote that book today, I would write a very different book for a lot of different reasons. So if anybody's out there who would like to fund me while I write the next edition, get in touch. So like things change. And to me, that's part of what's interesting, right? Is that the web today is not what the web was in 2000. Thank goodness. And also it's terrible. And also say yes to weird things. Opportunities are going to come up that you can't predict. And just saying yes might put you in a place that makes you incredibly happy and uses your amazing skills in ways that you never imagined. The other is getting senior really, for me, has meant moving from being doer practitioner to being an enabler and teacher and coach. And that also means zooming way out from product design to organizational design to culture change, and using the skills and practices that we have in human-centered design on those areas. My job really at DHS the last 3 years was culture change, was not delivering services. And I think if I'd had another year, I might have been able to make even more change there. But I firmly believe that we had a really great impact. That's what I would say about those things. Now, in the time and place that we are in, the timeline that for many of us sucks so very much, what I recommend is that if you love design and you want to do it, find some place to loan your services to. A mutual aid, a nonprofit that you believe in, make your own thing, show up and volunteer and help other people through the skills and talents that you have. It will be emotionally rewarding, and it will also be a good distraction from the insanity of what's happening.
I kind of want to start a Kickstarter to have enough money for you to organize a whole bunch of human-centered design people and usability people and like matrix us out to volunteer opportunities.
Oh, there is an organization called the U.S. Digital Response. It kicked off at the beginning of the pandemic specifically to help local governments respond digitally to the challenges that were going on. It's called usdr.org. And it very specifically recruits volunteers of varying experience with government and deploys them
Guess
on...
what? USDR.org is no more.
No, I don't believe that.
Oh, .gov maybe. Well, just the website, USDR.gov?
U.S. Digital Response.
Oh, U.S. Digital Response. Sorry, I just went USDR.
Yeah, I may have got the URL wrong.
U.S. Digital Response. Huh.
Yes, the URL is usdigitalresponse.org.
Okay, sorry.
All right.
I'll just cut that out.
Yeah, you can put your expertise to work there a few hours a week or a few
But is
hours a
that
month.
affiliated with the current regime? Or
It is not. It is not a government organization. It's a
Okay.
nonprofit.
Good. Thank you for saying that. Okay.
Yeah. It's an excellent group of folks who run it, and their portfolio of the kinds of projects that they've done over the last 5-6 years has just been really superb.
And here it is on screen. For those of you interested, you can volunteer with U.S. Digital Response to bring our skills anywhere that they are appropriate.
But there are so many mutual aid groups bubbling up in communities all over the place that need your help. This is also an excellent option. There are heritage organizations that are looking at protecting their members and their communities. This is also a great place to scrub in.
I love that. Dana, thank you so much for sharing this history lesson and amazing journey through your own adventures. We all can have these big adventures and we don't know where they're going to start. It's not like you knew when you got interested in hanging chads that this would then be the
I
art of
expected to run usability tests the rest of my life.
and instead you just kept putting yourself in the way of new puzzles, which required new and different solutions. And I just love the inspiration I get from that is that you kept doing really similar small things in bigger and bigger ways and in bigger and bigger organizations. And it's a good reminder that when we all are in a world, an environment, a LinkedIn culture where it's like you have to do big, you have to do bigger, you have to learn bigger, you have to, that actually some of the very small and very specific things that we've been taught from the very beginning are extraordinarily powerful tools uh,
Yeah.
that we should never forget about. Because having people watch other people go through something can be more powerful than a dozen giant reports, and usually
Oh, for sure. No question about that.
absolutely are. All right, are there any final thoughts you want to leave people as we're getting comments in from people who are so glad? Yeah, Pragya, I don't disagree. I'm so glad we're recording this. And how can we follow you and what you're doing next and support you, Dana?
I have one more thing to ask people to do, and that is the midterm elections are coming up in November in the United States. Being an election poll worker is an amazing experience. Everybody should do it at least once. You are much needed in your community to do that. Take a day and do it. You'll need some training too, but that's usually only a few hours. So do that thing. Who knows what's next?
Somebody, maybe, I don't know. When you figure it out, let us know. In the meantime, people, please follow Dana on LinkedIn and at danachisnell.com. And thank you so much. And just write your questions into the chat here or share this with anybody that you know so that we can share the amazing brain of Dana with everybody else. Thank you so much, Dana.
Thank you, Tamara. I really appreciate it. If you find me on LinkedIn and you want to connect, tell me that you saw this because otherwise I will ignore your request.
Fair enough. Okay, everybody, join me again for the next episode of Corporate Underpants. The next one you're going to see is I'm going to release Julie Francis's interview, and then I'm going to release this interview. And if you can think of other great minds that should absolutely be on Corporate Underpants, please let me know. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you for joining me for another episode of Corporate Underpants, and there's lots more to come. If you have any projects that you need my help on, if you're interested in coaching to become a senior product leader through understanding alignment in politics, or if you're interested in any of the classes or books that I'm developing, please visit my website, adlininc.com, and get in touch.